They said China never kneels. But in May 2025, the vice premier boarded a plane to Geneva alone. No delegation fanfare. No handshake photo. No press. Just 8 hours in a closed room. And silence. According to Bloomberg, in April 2025, the U.S. imposed tariffs of 145% on Chinese goods. Some categories climbed to 245%. That same week, Trump wrote just 2 words: major progress. Markets surged. And Beijing? No briefing. No statement. No clip on CCTV. Only one line in People's Daily. One meeting cannot solve everything. Not even a lie. Just an echo. They said the meeting was arranged at Washington's request. But it wasn't. Beijing had begged for it. Privately. Persistently. And quietly. They said China stands firm. But the door to Washington didn't open. Until Beijing sent someone high enough to bow. This wasn't a summit. It was a screening. And when no agreement is announced, no position declared, no victory claimed, you have to wonder, if China didn't win anything, and the US didn't give anything, what exactly happened behind the closed door? And why is Beijing so afraid to say it out loud? They said the Chinese economy was strong enough to absorb short-term pressure. They said tariffs don't matter. But by April 2025, the cracks weren't just visible. They were gaping. According to China's General Administration of Customs, in April 2025, exports to the U.S. dropped by 12.3%. Guangdong's decline hit 15.4%. Shenzhen's orders shrank over 20%. Still, no one admitted there was a problem. State media called it normal fluctuations. According to Bloomberg, the U.S. imposed punitive tariffs of up to 145% on Chinese goods. Some products faced 245%. Beijing responded with its own 125% tariffs. But it was theater. China wasn't retaliating. It was hoping Washington would pick up the phone. And Washington didn't. So Beijing had to send someone higher. Not to demand anything, but to get back in the room. In the same month, China's new export orders index plunged to 44.7. The Caixin Services PMI dropped to 50.7. 2 numbers, both falling. No alarms on TV. No headlines in bold. Only soft phrases. Macro adjustments are underway. That's what they called it when factory workers were sent home. When payment cycles stopped. When banks stopped answering calls. Adjustment. In Dongguan, machines sat idle for weeks. Not broken. Not decommissioned. Just untouched. Managers told workers, no new order yet. Come back next week. They didn't come back. Others didn't ask. What's the point? If the order books are empty, no amount of waiting will fill them. And when silence became routine, so did denial. One factory posted a banner in March, fighting together through hard times. By April, the banner was gone. So was the factory. No announcement. Just a closed gate and dust on the loading dock. The government didn't mention it. The papers didn't explain it. Because to say it out loud would make it real. And in Beijing, nothing is more dangerous than reality. Especially when it doesn't match the narrative. That's why, when the commerce minister tried to meet with the U.S. in April, he was rejected. Not because of policy. Because of rank. So China had to send its vice premier to Switzerland. And still, not a word was spoken after. Just silence. They say China negotiates from strength. But strong nations don't beg for meetings. They don't keep quiet after attending them. They don't deny the numbers while quietly trying to stop the bleeding. In the logistics parks of Zhejiang, more trucks are parked than moving. In Yiwu, fewer containers are sealed each day. In Suzhou, export agents now offer discounts before clients even ask. And still, the party says, everything is under control. But when everything is under control, you don't send your top official to Geneva. You don't come home without a press briefing. You don't pretend nothing happened. Unless what happened is what you're not allowed to admit. That this time, the US didn't just hit China's economy. It hit the mask. And what's behind it is something Beijing isn't ready to show the world or its own people. Beijing said the Geneva meeting was normal. But what's normal about flying your vice premier to a closed-door talk and not saying what was discussed? They said no breakthroughs were expected. Then why send someone that high? They said China stands strong. But strong nations don't knock twice. Just to be told which chair they're allowed to sit in. That's not strength. That's what happens when your own system won't let you admit you're cornered. Inside China, the people weren't told. They never are. The meeting didn't lead the evening news. No clips. No photographs. No transcript. Only one blurry headline: constructive exchanges may continue. It wasn't a report. It was a placeholder. And in a country where everything is scripted, a missing script is the loudest sign of panic. In Dingguan, factory owners don't call it a crisis. They call it pausing operations. But no one knows when they'll restart. Some quietly sold equipment. Others locked their gates. And their workers? They didn't protest. They vanished. Trains heading west grew more crowded. Not with hope. With retreat. No slogans. No banners. Just men with bags. Leaving cities that no longer needed them. Returning to villages that can't afford to feed them. Some local governments called it reverse urbanization. Others stopped commenting entirely. What do you say when everything your economic miracle relied on is evaporating? In Zhejiang, logistics firms say volume is light this season. It's not a season. It's a breakdown. But in Beijing, they still use words like macro recalibration, as if the problem is technical, as if the solution is semantic, as if calling it something else will make it less real. It won't. The Geneva meeting wasn't a failure. It was a mirror. And Beijing didn't like what it saw. A government obsessed with control is now trapped by its own silence. If it admits weakness, it loses face. If it stays silent, it loses time. But the world isn't waiting. Buyers are moving elsewhere. Investors are reading between the lines. Partners are asking hard questions. And inside the country, no one is allowed to ask any. That's the real fracture. Not in trade. Not in tariffs. In trust. They said China is unshaken. But if that were true, they would have shown the footage. They would have named the agenda. They would have claimed the win. Instead, they hid the result. And when a government hides its own steps, you have to ask, was it because the step was backwards? Or because it wasn't their step to take? They said it was just about tariffs. A few percentage points. A pricing dispute. Nothing strategic. But the room in Geneva wasn't built for price lists. It was built for surrender. Not of goods. Of design. Trump didn't want China to buy more soybeans. He wanted Beijing to admit one thing. That its model, a state-backed, closed-data, subsidized competition, no longer fits the world that made it rich. And deep down, they knew it. That's why there was no press conference. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they couldn't say it. The US didn't show up to discuss adjustments. They showed up to discuss architecture. And China came with a sales pitch to a room that was rewriting the blueprint. For years, Beijing believed global trade was a game of numbers. If they could export more, subsidize deeper, assemble faster, they'd win. But by 2025, the game changed. Washington wasn't competing anymore. It was replacing. Not through speeches. Through alliances. Nearshoring in Mexico. Rare earths from Canada. Semiconductors from Taiwan and the Netherlands. Battery metals from Africa rerouted by U.S., Japan, Australia packs. And China? They were still negotiating for 2010. In a world that had already moved past 2020. That's why Geneva wasn't a negotiation. It was a check-in. The US wanted to see how far Beijing would bend, without being asked to kneel. And Beijing bent. They just didn't tell anyone. Because inside the system, to bend is betrayal. Even if everyone knows it's happening. That's the paradox of authoritarian pride. You can compromise everything, as long as you never admit you compromised anything. So they sent their vice premier. Silently. Strategically. Desperately. No announcement. No joint statement. Just quiet presence and quiet retreat. And while Beijing remained fixated on tariff rates, Washington was measuring something else entirely. Compliance. Not legal. Structural. Would China agree to reduce subsidies? Would they allow inspection into data transparency? Would they stop exporting deflation through manipulated pricing? They didn't say yes, but they didn't say no. And that was enough. For the US, silence was a signal. For Beijing, silence was protection. But for the rest of the world, it was a reveal. Because this wasn't about products anymore. It was about who writes the rules of the next 20 years. And for the first time in decades, China wasn't holding the pen. They were in the waiting room, not to lead, to be screened. Because the real shift didn't happen in Geneva. It happened long before, when America stopped reacting. They started designing trade pacts, military basing, resource lockups. a wall of coordination that stretched from Eastern Europe to Southeast Asia. And when China finally noticed, they didn't respond with strategy. They responded with slogans. They said win-win. They said shared future. But they couldn't say what that future was, because they weren't the ones writing it anymore. So Geneva wasn't a turning point. It was a mirror. And when China looked in, they saw a version of themselves they weren't prepared to admit. Dependent on access, desperate for legitimacy, powerful in theory, but voiceless when it mattered most. And when a superpower flies across the world, just to stay silent, that silence isn't diplomacy. It's submission by omission. They said it was under control, but control doesn't look like this. Not when factory lights shut off at 3 p.m. Not when shipping yards sit half-loaded. Not when owners walk away from warehouses they once called home. In Zhejiang, a toy exporter closed in April. No bankruptcy filed. No press note. Just silence. And a handwritten sign. Closed for restructuring. It's a code. Everyone knows it means gone for good. Another clothing firm in Jiangsu quietly stopped payroll. The staff didn't protest. They just stopped showing up. Some went home. Some took up delivery work. Some disappeared. That's the first layer business. Revenue dried up. Margins collapsed. Clients vanished. Beijing said this was market optimization. But what's being optimized? When hundreds of factories shut down, without even a headline, then came the workers. They didn't strike. They retreated. Trains to inland provinces filled early, months before the Spring Festival. No parades. No slogans. Just tired men carrying bags and bank receipts. Some owed 3 months of wages. Others just wanted to leave before the gates locked for good. In Shenzhen, some dormitories now sit empty on weekdays. Not because of scheduling, because there's no more production to schedule. Local governments don't call it unemployment. They call it labor realignment. No benefits, no retraining, just reclassification. Then came the families. The middle-class families built on exports. Managers, freight brokers, procurement officers, all began recalculating survival. One man in Foshan used to run purchasing for a US brand. 2 mortgages. 1 child in international school. Health insurance. A retirement fund. By May, he was selling coffee machines on Taobao. He never said the word layoff. Just, the order cycle paused. His neighbors knew better. They were selling too. That's what a collapse looks like in China. No noise. Just a long chain of listings. One asset at a time. By mid-year, some international schools cut services. Bus routes dropped. Cafeterias downsized. Families pulled out not because they wanted to, but because their liquidity vanished. They don't call it crisis. They call it lifestyle change. And when people stop naming the truth, they lose more than money. They lose clarity. Then came the bankers. Coastal banks stopped lending to exporters. Quietly, systematically, loan officers refused to meet. Credit terms tightened. Overdraft lines disappeared. Banks blamed risk exposure. But risk isn't new. The rules changed because Beijing couldn't promise recovery. And when recovery becomes a wish, lenders become ghosts. Some factory owners were told, "You're too reliant on US clients." But everyone is, because the system built itself on that very dependency. Now it's being punished for obeying its own blueprint. And finally came the media, not with headlines, but with absence. State channels spoke of innovation clusters. They showed footage of drone launches, of agricultural pilots, of rural redevelopment, but never a word about why port traffic is down, or why export revenue has stalled, or why entire cities seem quieter. That's not oversight. That's policy. Because when the system can't fix it, it buries it. And in the silence, the layers break together. Workers leave cities. Bosses disappear. Banks hide losses. Families offload debt. And no one says it's a crash. Because if no one names it, the party keeps control. But the world sees. Buyers see delays. Partners see silence. Credit markets see risk. And what once looked like resilience now looks like reluctance to admit the truth. China's economic engine isn't screaming. It's stalling. And in that quiet descent, the collapse is not explosive. It's administrative, sanitized, repackaged, filed under euphemisms. But it's real. And it's not just financial. It's social. It's generational. It's systemic. A nation that once exported goods is now exporting uncertainty. And the question that no one in Beijing will answer is simple. If this isn't a crisis, why is everyone behaving like it is? They said China never kneels, but they flew to Geneva uninvited, sat through 8 hours, said nothing after, and left without a word. No handshake, no headline, just a line. No breakthroughs expected. But if there was no deal, why the silence? And if there was a deal, why can't it be spoken? Because when power becomes desperate, language becomes careful. And when careful becomes silent, something deeper has cracked. Maybe this wasn't about trade. Maybe it wasn't even about economics. Maybe Geneva was where the system admitted it couldn't fix itself, but only in private. And maybe the real question isn't, what did China offer? Or what did America take? Maybe the question is, when a nation stops speaking to its own people and speaks only behind closed doors, is it still negotiating? Or just buying time before the silence gets noticed?